want to welcome Professor James Kaufman. Thank you very much for joining this interview and this this course. And James Kaufman, together with Robert J. Sternberg, they're the editors of these volumes. The first one I'm holding here on my hand is the International Handbook of Creativity. And the second one, it's really the standard volume for creativity researchers. It's the Cambridge Handbook of Creativity. And those two people, Professor James C. Kaufman and Professor Robert J. Sternberg, are considered as the leading thinkers in creativity research. So thank you so much for joining us. Professor James Kaufman, he is professor at the Department of Psychology at the California State University, San Bernardino, and director of the Learning Research Institute. He received his PhD at Yale University in 2001, and his research and teaching interests can be summarized broadly in three big areas. The first one is creativity, the second one is student success, and the third one is non-cognitive constructs. Courses that he's teaching and taught in the past are critical thinking, intelligence and creativity, psychology and the movies, and tests and measurement. Furthermore, I'd like to add that it seems that Professor James Kaufman is receiving each and every year an honors and awards for his outstanding research. So there are too many to announce them one by one, but you can be assured that everybody is well aware of the fact that he's outstanding. All right, so after this humbling intro, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
All right. So as I discussed with you in the previous interview, I'd like to ask some questions, and you are free to answer them as comprehensively as you want. All right. The very first question I'd like to ask you is, what is creativity and what is creativity research?
Okay. The typical way that psychology creativity researchers define creativity is as something that is both new and appropriate, where new is the one that's very intuitive. So if I ask you to tell me a story and you say, once upon a time there was a boy. Well, okay, that's not new. That's not original. That's not even interesting. So everybody would say, oh yeah, that's not really creative. It's not new.
Right.
But the second part, being appropriate, being relevant to the task. If I ask you to tell me a story and you say, once upon a time, the elephant shot out some rhubarb and they both danced all the way to the island where they conjugated verbs for an hour. Mm-hmm. Well, that's new, that's different, it's unusual. But in terms of telling a story, it's not coherent. It's not fulfilling the task demands of being an actual story.
Right.
So most creativity researchers would argue, well, it's not quite creative. And this is particularly true, for example, if you want to build a creative bridge. If that bridge falls down, it doesn't matter how pretty it is. It's not a creative bridge. Creativity researchers and creativity research kind of come from everywhere. So it's not like there's a branch of psychology or education called, creativity studies. You have some people who study cognitive psychology and are interested in how the mind works. And they're also interested in how creativity comes out of the mind. But you have people who are social psychologists who are interested in how creativity might be perceived by others, or if there's a stigma against creativity. You have people in education who want to look at how can you teach kids to be more creative. You have people in business who want to look at how can organizations be more creative. You have people in personality who are interested in the creative personality. So in a sense, creativity research is kind of like this trail that kind of snakes its way through a lot of different science and education and other type of departments. I think that it's an exciting time to study creativity. I mean, broadly, there are 4 ways that we study it. And this is a 50-year-old conception that's still kind of relevant. Some of us study the creative process. So what's going on in your head when you're creative? How are you creative? Other people study the creative person. So, well, what does it mean to be creative? What types of people are creative? What types of people might be creative geniuses? Other people will study the creative product. So what makes, this painting considered very creative and this painting not? What makes people appreciate these type of creative things, but not these creative things? Mm-hmm. And then other people study the creative, what's often called press or place. Really, it's environment. What can help people be creative? What is it about our surroundings and our environment? And creativity is a big enough field that there are people who study creativity who I know nothing about, even though they're very well known, just in terms of they're doing this and I'm doing this. Right. So it's a very diverse and kind of wonderful field in that sense, because if you're interested in almost anything within research, the odds are you can probably apply creativity to it.
Right. Okay, awesome. This leads us to the next question, and I'm sure that there's no definite answer. It really depends on it depends on the fact in which area of creativity research you are currently working. But how can creativity be measured?
The most common way is through something called divergent thinking.
Right.
And this has been done since literally, J.P. Guilford was talking about this in 1950. So this has been around for a long time. Paul Torrance probably popularized the most common measure, but where it's giving an open-ended question. And it could be done visually or it could be done as a question. Mm-hmm. And then having people respond with as many different responses. So I might say, what would happen if you didn't need sleep? Mm-hmm. And then, okay, people would go, well, you could stay up all night. You could get a lot more work done. There would be no more mattress sales. And this can be scored many, many different ways. Two of the key ones is fluency, which is sheer output. How many different things can you say?
Right.
And originality. How rare are your responses?
Okay.
And this is still the most popular way of measuring creativity. Mm-hmm. Another way, which I like a little better, is the consensual assessment technique. And what that involves is having people actually do something creative, write a poem, draw a picture, design a bridge, come up with an experiment. And then you have qualified experts in the field. So this could be poets, it could be people who teach poetry, it could be people who are aware of poetry, if it's poetry. And they rate it for how creative is it based on their own judgments.
Right.
And they don't consult with other people. And we found that people tend to agree. Mm-hmm. The problem with this assessment is that it's time consuming. It's a pain in the butt. Mm-hmm. You need experts, you need all this stuff. And in reality, most of us don't have access to that. There are also some types of almost problem solving type measures. Some of it are like insight problems. So if I were to ask you, if you're walking down the street and you see some coal, a carrot, and a scarf on the grass, mm-hmm. Why might that be there?
Okay.
And in this case, the answer is a snowman melted. There's also the remote associates test, which gives 3 words that are related that you need to by a common word, and you need to come up with that word. So, for example, grass, envy, money. They're all green.
Oh, what is the solution? Sorry.
Green.
Green. Okay.
It's just green. Envy is associated with green.
Right. Okay.
No method is perfect. If you compare it, for example, to intelligence, you have all these IQ tests, and there is so much data behind them, and that you can argue whether or not IQ tests are good or valid, but they exist, and they exist backed by a whole bunch of data. Creativity tests just aren't that evolved. There are many ways of measuring creativity. There are many very clever and creative ways of measuring creativity, but there's nothing at that level of being standardized or, if you want to measure IQ, you would do this and that. With creativity, there's many different ways.
Right, okay.
It can be frustrating.
I see. Mm-hmm. Okay, you were mentioning intelligence, right, and IQ tests and so forth. One major debate I've been reading about also in one of your volumes is the relationship between creativity and intelligence. Yeah, what can you tell us about this relationship? Does this relationship actually exist? Is it proven or not?
For years, there was something called the threshold hypothesis, which is that intelligence and creativity were related up to a point, about a 120 IQ, and then it was scattered. There was no relationship. More recently, most studies have shown this isn't necessarily the case. That they're related, but they're related slightly. So about a 0.20 correlation, or significant but small. A lot, however, depends on, again, the types of measures. So there have been, as well as the types of the nature of the intelligence measured. So most of these studies have used general measures of intelligence, like G, whereas kind of some more recent sophisticated studies have looked at, for example, you have crystallized intelligence, which is more about your knowledge, your acquired knowledge. You have fluid, which is more about how well you can problem solve.
Right.
You have things like working memory, which is, what you can store in your head. Generally, the most actually, in a study I actually just read, a lot of intelligence is related to some of the more cognitive aspects of creativity. So, for example, fluency, being able to, associational fluency, being able to come up with many different ideas is very related to intelligence.
Right.
And it's pretty related to creativity. But intelligence and creativity, it's a weaker relationship. So there are dimensions of creativity that are more about creative thinking and the thought process behind creativity. And those are pretty related to creativity, to intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
Whether, let's say, creativity as most people would think of creativity, like an artist painting a picture, it's not necessarily quite as strong.
All right. And what is your opinion on Sir Ken Robinson's work and especially his TED Talk on the relationship between creativity and the education system? As you know, the one big idea that Sir Ken Robinson is promoting is that our today's education system is educating our kids from their original creativity capabilities, so to speak. What is your take on that? How do you think our today's education system doesn't encourage creative thinking and the innate creativity that actually all children have?
It's not that I would say I disagree with that point,
Mm-hmm.
as much as I think that he's focusing and over-focusing on the wrong aspect.
Okay.
He doesn't actually do any research. So it's not a matter of the work he's done, it's a matter of the one talk that he's given over and over again.
Right.
I think it's great that he's raised the issue. I think he's charismatic, he's funny. I think that it's great that he is hopefully putting in people's minds, wow, we should think about creativity. I guess I feel like teachers are overloaded. It is very easy to blame teachers, and I think it's a little silly. Of course, there are some teachers who discourage creativity, and there are some bosses who discourage creativity, and there are some parents who discourage creativity. I think, to me, the question is, how can we help teachers encourage creativity within the rules they have to follow, within this system where teachers report to the principals, who report to the superintendents, who report to guidelines, at least in America, we establish for what we expect, overwhelming standardized tests. Whether this is good or bad, it certainly doesn't help creativity, but that's changing things from a mighty high level. Do I think it would be great if we could emphasize other things at the high, top-down approach? Of course. I also wish we could end world hunger. Right. These are all great, noble things that would be very hard to change top-down. I'm more interested in bottom-up. giving teachers who care about this stuff tools. There are ways that we can stay within the curriculum and content standards and still nurture and encourage creativity. In that the kind of almost knee-jerk, schools are bad, they kill creativity. Well, okay, so what? Okay, what do we do?
Right.
And in some cases, we just go around the country and we give talks and we rile people up and don't offer solutions. And I don't mean to sound like, I don't mean to rip into Ken Robinson. I think that he's good at what he does. But I wish that people were, it's the same way that if you post something on Facebook and you say, share if you're against bullying, everybody shares it. Who isn't against bullying?
Right.
But if you see somebody being bullied and there's actual consequences to you, your safety, and your life, most people don't do anything.
Mm.
Most people would say, yes, sure, creativity is important. Well, okay. Why don't we come up with ways that teachers can teach creativity and while still within this guideline? Why don't we, do we really think, if we think creativity is important, do we think it's more important than math? I don't know. I study creativity. I wouldn't necessarily argue that. Is creativity more important than reading? Some people say that. I don't. I think creativity is amazingly important. It's one of the things I've devoted my life to. But there are other things that school needs to do. Schools do. And I think that I would rather focus on how can we continue to teach kids reading and math and all the stuff they need to know, and critical thinking and creative thinking.
Right.
And there are ways we can basically do this without destroying the curriculum. And that's what interests me more.
All right. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. Obviously, you have given it a deep thought, right? And you were dealing with Sir Ken Robinson beforehand. So that's very interesting to hear your thoughts. Let's move on to the next relationship that is also related to the first one. And what is the connection or relationship between creativity and happiness?
It's often framed the other way, which is creativity and mental illness. And they are kind of sides of a different coin. I think it's one of those questions where there are so many qualifications that in some ways it makes the answer a little less interesting. But there is evidence that creativity enhances mood. You do something creative, you tend to feel a little better. There is also evidence, and I find this stuff really exciting, it's fairly new work that shows that creativity can really be used for what's called post-traumatic growth. And the idea that when something terrible's happened, and a researcher named Marie Fogiard has actually been looking at this in Rwanda and in places where these terrible things have happened, people can use creativity to heal. I think that's fascinating. I think that's wonderful. You look at the work of James Pennebaker, and certain types of expressive writing, which is creative, help you. So if you take 3 or 4 times a day and you just write something that's almost like this narrative about how you feel, what's going on in your life, you will generally show higher physical health, mental health, less risky behaviors, all these wonderful things. Yet the flip side is that there is this association people talk about between creativity and mental illness. What does that mean? I think a large part of it is that a lot of the research on creativity and mental illness is spotty.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of it, most of what we know is based on 3 or 4 studies that are very flawed. And I'm actually editing a book on creativity and mental illness coming out hopefully end of this year, which is a bunch of new research and stuff to me that reflects the complexity of it. I think that at the everyday level, at the level that any of us are creative, I think it's a good thing. It's linked with happiness, it's linked with good positive things. I think it is possible at the higher levels that there may be complications.
Okay, got it. In what way does the concept of flow plays? Yeah, flow is essential or important to the connection of creativity and happiness.
I mean, I think the biggest one is that flow is fun.
Right.
You know, and that it's something that I think Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi has done a nice job of kind of presenting, which is that when we truly lose ourselves, whether it's, whether it's me writing an article or somebody playing the violin or somebody, whatever, when we lose ourselves in that creativity, it's a high. It's this great, terrific feeling, and you're just ready to kind of tackle the world. And I mean, some people might get that from, climbing mountains. I don't. But, people get that flow in sometimes other ways than creativity. But I think that for people who engage flow and creativity, it gets your adrenaline pumping. It's just amazing, exciting feeling that I think, if there's a small list of things that truly make life worthwhile, you have family and loved ones and children and this and that. And, one of them I think is that sense of flow and accomplishment from doing whatever it is that you do that is your special creative thing or thing.
Okay, awesome. I mean, one interesting aspect that he was writing in his book Flow is that in order to be creative, there is also a certain threshold of ability, as far as I can remember. So there is, the process of becoming competent in one specific area is hard, and you do not really feel that you're creative and you're not in the flow. But as soon as you have reached a certain threshold, then you really can enjoy yourself and start being creative, actually.
A model that Ron Beghetto and I have developed is called the 4C model.
Okay.
And it takes a lot of this into account,
Right.
where we argue that kind of the first aspect is what we call mini C, and that's the creativity inherent in the learning process. That's, those are personal insights, things like that. As we grow, we hit little c, and that's the everyday creativity. And that's what comes from getting feedback on your work, from doing it more. And, that's, sometimes we call it county fair creativity. When, you go to a county fair, you go to a thing and you see like, homemade bird feeders, you see art, things like that. People who read their poetry at a cafe. And again, wonderful. It's not probably quite, it's not at the expert level yet. Mm-hmm. And we then argue for what we call pro-C. And that's the kind of expert creativity. And it's between little c and pro-C that I would argue is when you truly begin to develop flow.
Okay.
Like pro-C, you're an expert, you've put in, which is about 10 years of deliberate practice. You're recognized. And that between little c and pro-C, and obviously beyond, also we have big C, which is the creative genius that's remembered for years. But you do need that knowledge-based feedback awareness that, yes, okay, I'm writing this story and I've read enough stories to know what good fiction is. And, you need to know the basic laws of a domain before you can.
Right, definitely. All right. Okay. Very nice. Let's move on. Let's integrate the aspect of geography and regions. We have arrived at Richard Florida and his concept of the creative class. Do you think it's possible to say that that in certain areas, regions, and countries and cities of the world, people are more creative than in others?
I think there's certainly truth to it. I think some of this is opportunities. Mm-hmm. So if you live in New York City, you are surrounded by everything. It can be overwhelming to some people, but let's say that you want to be involved in theater. Right. If you live in the middle of nowhere, you may never get to see a professional play. You may never meet people who work in theater. It may just be community and regional theater, which is wonderful, but a certain level. If you live in New York, you can be exposed to anything in the world. Um, I don't love the specific, like these countries or cultures are more creative than other cultures. I think there's a lot to it in terms of types of creativity. So I've actually been doing a lot of cross-cultural work. It's one of the big kind of thrusts I've been doing, and people perceive creativity differently.
Right.
So in the West, there's this push to, towards complete originality, almost wacky, out there. You're not creative unless you're, jumping up and down and doing a handstand wearing a Statue of Liberty costume.
Right.
Whereas in a lot of Asian cultures, there's interest in taking something good and making it better.
Mm-hmm.
Going back and like, for example, taking an aspect of your culture or history and being creative within that. That's also creativity. And there's no value judgment. One is not better than the other.
Right.
Howard Gardner and some of his colleagues often talk about the vertical and horizontal aspects, and I'm going to butcher it because I don't have it in front of me, but one of them involves the amount of constraints. So there are some people who draw on a grain of rice and think about how amazingly complex that is, and the technique, the nuance, and just being able to do anything in that is an amazing creative accomplishment. There are other people who might be performance artists, and they can, dump a bucket of fish over their head and do whatever they want. They're both creative. They're different types of creativity, and I think that different cultures may gravitate more to different types of creativity, different conceptions of it. That doesn't make one more or less creative than the other. That said, I think that if you're going beyond necessarily the cultural dimension, but more looking at like geographical places where there are opportunities, where there are exposures, that's certainly true. And
what? Okay, just to get this straight, Richard Florida is saying that there are so-called 3 T's of economic growth, right? And those regions who are performing well in these 3 indices. The first one is talent, that is highly correlated with the human capital index. So, and the second one is technology, the infrastructure, so to speak. And the third one is tolerance, the lifestyle aspect, right? And what he argues is that those cities and regions who are performing well in all 3 areas are the cities that first are more successful in attracting the most creative minds, and consequently are also having a higher creative potential generally. And you already answered the first 2 aspects, talent and technology, that convey the idea of opportunity. What is your take on the importance of lifestyle and tolerance for creative people?
Oh, I think it's huge. The example that popped in my head when you were saying this was, like back in the 80s, 1980s, I remember a lot of the, I think one was in Ohio, a lot was in the South. A lot of rap artists and other singers would be arrested for like lewd indecency type stuff, and not shockingly, that's the kind of thing that doesn't promote creativity. The less tolerance, the less permission you give people to be creative. And I think that, I think it's huge. And I think it's something true at any level, whether it's a country or a culture or education or business. One of the biggest, so for example, within business, one of the best things a leader can do is to model creativity and to show, look, I can be creative also, along with providing the resources and opportunities. People get used to being scolded for their creativity from an early age. giving people permission to be creative, and not necessarily to be wild. I mean, I don't necessarily mean to be out of control or chaotic or bouncing across, but giving people permission to be creative is huge. I mean, I think it's one reason why, whatever the debates are about brainstorming, and there's a lot of debate whether or not it works, but the concept, say whatever you want with no judgment, gives people permission to be creative. It's one reason why, for example, within education, I think a decent recommendation is to have at least some time devoted to things that aren't graded, aren't evaluated, where anything can be explored. I mean, it's why if you look at a lot of the really top companies, they give people time to work on their pet projects. I mean, the classic hackneyed cliche story is 3M, where they gave Art, blocking on his name, but the guy who developed Post-it notes,
right?
They gave people personal time. And it was on his 10 or 20% personal time that he used these insights, this type of tape, and developed Post-it notes, which obviously is the only thing we really know 3M for.
Right.
Without that time, without that tolerance, without that, and not even just tolerance, but also acknowledgement, yes, this is important. So we're going to give you these resources, time, and not everything, but within reason. That is huge. I mean, just walking down the street, and I keep coming back to New York, because it's to me one of, but you see people dressed in weird ways, you see all sorts of different things, and it doesn't really stand out. I mean, there's a great photographer who has a series called Humans of New York, which is very, very popular on Facebook. Mm-hmm. And it just captures the magic of the city, where people have this unique character. And I mean, obviously, it's not just New York. You could do that kind of thing from many different places.
Yeah.
But you have that tolerance and acceptance of difference that I think does help.
All right. Okay. We've almost reached the end of the interview. The very last three questions I'd like to ask you is, what can nation states do to establish a more creative-friendly environment for its citizens and organizations?
I think one of the biggest things is resources. Let's say we're talking as a nation, start an education. That doesn't mean no standardized tests, but it means allowing the students to be creative. It means there are so many things that can be done that benefit the community, the state, that encourage creativity. I mean, there's some places where there's a citywide book club and everybody reads the same book, that kind of a thing. It encourages a certain type of development. I mean, in addition to having this tolerance resources component, you can't be creative if you don't know something exists. I mean, if you've never learned about physics at all, you're not going to be creative in physics. You won't know it's possible. And like a lot of times if I speak to high school students or younger, they may have no idea what it means to be a research psychologist. A psychologist is somebody who helps people and, talks about their problems. Well, that's true of some psychologists. I'm the kind who doesn't help people. And just being aware, wow, you can do this, is something huge. I think that anything that encourages people to be open to new experiences is huge, whether that's, this is why there's a concept of having like subsidies for public television, and so you can be exposed to many different things. And you have things like Dora the Explorer, Sesame Street, which, having two boys, I'm completely sick of it, but it's a good thing. And it's kind of a common leveler. If you have public television or the likes that's free and available for everybody, then socioeconomic status is less important and everybody can be creative. It's the same way that if you look at digital literacy, That's another area where, left to its own devices, you will have an SES split because computers are expensive. Wi-Fi is expensive. If you have, as has been happening more and more, libraries having a bunch of computers you can use, having schools with computers, all of a sudden, almost everybody has some exposure and access to a computer online. And it's that same principle with creativity.
Okay, got it. Yeah, to offer and provide resources so people have the opportunities to start becoming creative. Okay. So I guess the same principle also applies for organizations as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, modeling for the leader should model creativity. There should be time when people can, even if it's a small percentage, devote to their own ideas and exploring things.
Right.
There, and this time shouldn't be evaluated the same way.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to evaluate people based on this and this and this. Ideally, the initial creative development stuff ideally should not be evaluated. It should not be graded or too much emphasis on tangible, physical, external rewards, bonuses, raises, and stuff. I mean, money is good, but it gets people to focus away from the creative aspect and focus more on the tangible goods. Particularly if you want something to be creative and you're offering a reward simply for the completion of the task. If you let people know you want it to be creative, that at least helps.
Okay. The final question is a personal one. What do you do to be more creative, and what have you learned personally and naturally, also professionally? What works for you? What kind of environment and mood works for you in order to be creative?
It's a good question. Personally, I need a block of hours, a little bit of peace and quiet. Mm-hmm. It's hard to be creative on cue, on demand.
Right.
It's easier to revise and do the more logical stuff on demand. If you already value creativity, if you already want to be creative, I mean, some of it is practice. When I was a little kid, I wanted to be a creative writer. And I wrote to all these well-known creative writers, and a lot of them wrote back, and I asked for advice. Mm-hmm. And the number one thing was read and write. If you want to be a writer, you have to read and 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 read. You have to learn everything about what you want to be creative in. But then you also have to write and write and write more and throw out and write and throw out. Be aware the first thing you do isn't going to be great. Be able to have your stuff critiqued and analyzed without taking it personally. Ray Bradbury's great quote was, "God's gift to young writers is not letting them know how bad they are." And that, on one hand, that kind of curve of developing a certain expertise and being creative, some of it is very unfun. It means a certain amount of repetition, a certain amount of failure, but it's also a process of discovery. So in a sense, my advice to somebody kind of starting out would be very different than my advice, let's say, to what I do to try to be more creative. But even then, I'm always reading new articles. I'm always, trying to talk to people because, there's a ton of stuff I don't know about creativity research. So trying to be creative about creativity research means writing a ton. It means reading a ton. It means talking with people a ton. And it means making sure that I have my own time to explore my own ideas.
All right. I'm trying to wrap this up, Professor Kaufman. Thank you so much. So,
it is my pleasure.
So in the first part of the interview, Professor John Kaufman, he answered the question what creativity actually is and means, and how it can be measured, and also gave an overview of the current creativity research. In the second part, Professor Kaufman unveiled the complex relationships between creativity and intelligence, and creativity and happiness and also mental illness. And in the last and final part, Professor Kaufman explained what nation states, what organizations, and what individuals can do in order to establish the right conditions for more creativity. Already, Professor Kaufman, thank you so much for taking your time. I know that you're super busy, and yeah, it's a really big honor that I had the authority in creativity research on the planet for my course. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure, Stephen. Thank you.